A deathbed confession is an admittance to a crime or crimes from someone who is nearing death. This confession may help alleviate any guilt, regret, secrets or sins the person may have had in their life. In prison and on death row, these kinds of confessions can also be quite commonplace. But for some, they become simply an opportunity to have the last word and assert their control over their captors and their victims' families. In 1989, one of the most infamous serial killers in history was facing the electric chair. Convicted of the murders of 20 women in 3 separate states, a geographic transience that would initially allow him to evade capture, he was charming, handsome and educated, the very personification of a lady killer. In his final days, he granted a series of interviews with detectives, claiming he was about to reveal the locations of many other victims. What followed was a game of cat and mouse, where fact and fantasy merged. Who is this serial killer who played mind games until the very end? Theodore Robert Cowell, or better known to you and me as Ted Bundy. In 1978, Ted Bundy was awaiting trial on the suspicion of having murdered over 30 women, all young college girls just starting to make their way in the world. Whilst on death row, he'd eventually confessed to the crimes, but these confessions would all become part of the killer's twisted game plan.
He's what you find when you travel out to the edge of human depravity. He's frightening in so many ways because he is out of the mold of so many other inadequate serial killers. He was charming, glib, persuasive, intelligent, articulate, successful. None of those things fit the mold. I can't understand how he came to be so monstrous. The others I can. This one I can't. I don't understand how you can become that detached and cruel and hideously arrogant.
There's no bones about it. I am looking for an opportunity to tell the story as best I can in the way that makes sense to me and the way that'll help.
He did not look like a serial killer, and he did not speak like a serial killer. He had a very direct but manipulative honesty about the way he spoke to other people that made them believe that what he was saying was in fact the truth.
A media frenzy surrounded Bundy on his arrest, and he was determined that media frenzy wouldn't fade once he was incarcerated. While sat in prison, Bundy plotted to become the curator of his own legend, and he was helped by the TV cameras. Bundy's sinister celebrity status was achieved by becoming one of the first murderers to get global airtime when the court trials became televised in the United States. Electing to defend himself, he turned the courtroom into a stage. His quick mind and good looks made him the first superstar serial killer. However, Bundy's court antics failed to win the jury over, and he was sentenced to death by electrocution.
In representing himself at his murder trials, Ted Bundy is the star of the show. Center stage. Everybody else is nothing. He's on television. World news are watching him. He is famous.
He became very skilled at arguing his case, and he argued in court, and in one case the judge actually commended him on his performance. He actually put up very good arguments, but he wanted to be in control. He enjoyed the whole game, and court is very much theatre, it's very much acting and role-playing and everything else, and he was very good at that because he was a psychopath.
Whilst on death row in Florida, Bundy became fixated with keeping his name in the headlines. And he achieved this by granting a series of extraordinary interviews with detectives, claiming to offer them information about the whereabouts of other victims.
This is a tape-recorded interview between Bob Keppel, Dave Reichert, and Ted Bundy. The date is 11/17 of '84. The time is 15.
It was Bundy's nemesis, Seattle detective Bob Keppel, the man who had helped to bring the curtain down on his murderous ways, whom the killer was most keen to talk to.
I can't remember what night of the week it was. Thursday night, I believe, I don't know. 11 to 12, probably closer to 12, on a warm Seattle May night. I mean, I think it was clear. Weather had been fairly good. I was moving up the alley using a briefcase and some crutches, and a young woman walked down. I saw her round the north end of the block into the alley and stop for a moment and then keep on walking down the alley toward me. And about halfway down the block, I encountered her and asked her to help me carry the briefcase, which she did, and we walked back up the alley.
He's reveling in it. You can hear it in his voice. You can hear it in everything he says. He's convinced that not only is he back in control, but that he is dictating the course and terms of the dialogue and what will happen to him. He even says, I think at a couple of points, that it's unfortunate, I'm going to need more time. It's in your best interest that you give me more time because I have so many valuable things I can share with you. The arrogance is extraordinary.
Basically, when we reached the car, what happened was I knocked her unconscious with a crowbar.
Did she see it?
No. There were some handcuffs there, along with the crowbar. And they handcuffed her and put her in the passenger side of the car and drove away.
Was she alive or dead?
Oh, no, she was unconscious, but she was very much alive. So the long and short of it was that I again knocked her unconscious and strangled her and drove her about 10 yards into the small grove of trees that was there.
Okay, Michael, Ted Bundy, one of the most discussed serial killers in the world. Everybody has an opinion about Ted Bundy. Everybody wants to talk about Ted Bundy. And I think what's interesting for me is that he's talking about Ted Bundy in a very particular set of circumstances. He's on death row and he's trying to buy time to stave off the execution. Did you pick up a number of places where he's trying to provide detail but not really provide detail?
But that's a common mechanism for many serial killers, that they'll only disclose information when it's to their advantage or to their benefit. And again, they'll engage in game playing, that they'll offer a little bit, but actually it could be a red herring. So they're wanting to play with the authorities in terms of information that they give. They're wanting to play with the authorities in terms of time. They're wanting to seem to cooperate, but not really. And it's all on their terms.
Up until this point, Bundy had been vague about his modus operandi and what he had done with his victims' bodies. All of that was to change.
Up that dirt road, beyond the grassy area. I'll try to trace it here on a piece of paper. How about that? That might help a little. I'm working from some pretty old memories. Well, let's do it this way. Here's the grassy area. Here's the road coming up, trees to the northwest of this grassy area.
Before being placed on death row, Bundy had divulged details of his crimes and his thinking, though he spoke mostly in the third person to avoid what he described as the stigma of confession. The details that he recounted to investigator Dennis Couch were amongst the few that would lead to the discovery of possible body parts belonging to his victims. However, when he granted an audience to Seattle investigator Bob Keppel, Under the guise of a confession, it would become clear that Bundy had something else on his mind, using the promise of new revelations to buy more time and stave off an execution. Seattle serial killer Ted Bundy charmed and murdered dozens of young college girls in a killing spree that lasted a decade. Whilst awaiting execution on death row, he made a series of chilling confessions. Now, for the first time, lip-sync technology can bring them to life.
What happened was I knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. There were some handcuffs there, along with the crowbar. And they handcuffed her and put her in the passenger side of the car and drove away.
Classic signs of psychopathy are a lack of any empathy, a lack of any guilt. He never expressed any guilt for his crime. You find that they role play emotions, they act out emotions, but they don't really feel the emotions. They know how to get other people to respond to them. They're often very socially skilled, often quite bright, so they're intellectually able to argue, they're able to convince people what they want to do, quite simply by not having any involvement in their emotional level. It's purely goal-orientated. I want this, this and this, that's what I'm going to do.
Ted Bundy created an image that was the very opposite of what people would imagine a serial killer to be. Stalking college campuses and student hangouts in his Volkswagen Beetle, the handsome, charming Bundy fitted in effortlessly.
Every woman loves a bug, a Beetle, especially co-eds. It's an iconic motor car, a bit like the British Mini, and it wouldn't draw attention to anybody. You know, there are hundreds of them all around where he was living in Seattle at the time. And again, it was very convenient for him. It was cheap to run. If it broke down, it was easy to fix. It could go off-road, on-road, everywhere you like. The whole thing about the Beetle is it's innocent.
He had a VW Beetle, and it became his most important prop because not only did that car look modest and laid back and of course reminded people of the film Herbie, and he used this Beetle to give the impression he was a very laid back, relaxed sort of character. Students loved it, it was appealing. If he turned up in a Rolls Royce, nobody would have trusted him an inch, but this was a guy turning up in a car like a lot of students drove themselves.
Bundy's MO always centered on presenting himself as being wounded and vulnerable. One favored scenario would see him pose on crutches, arm in a cast, desperate for some help with his broken down Beetle.
But more important than it just reminding people of the film Herbie, the trunk, the front trunk that you opened up, and if you took the wheel out and you left it like that, you could push a woman into there in one movement. And chillingly, that's exactly what he did.
Serial killers develop what they call a murder kit. Once they've killed once, they might think, well, next time I might need some more plastic sheeting because there's blood everywhere over my car. I might need another set of handcuffs. I might need rope.
The part of the crime that successful serial killers give more thought to is the disposal of their victims' bodies.
Bundy dragged his bodies into woodland, near ravines, off the beaten track, in forestry areas, to give him breathing space so he could get away as fast as possible, hoping that the body would be decomposed. Many of Bundy's skeletal remains of his victims had been scattered around by animals feeding off the remains. There'll be a leg bone 100 yards away, there'll be a hand somewhere else.
The sanctity of the sites was paramount to him and allowed him to continue to exert power and control over his victims long after they had died.
It was an attempt on my part, for example, to fill in part of the grave and then layer of heavy rocks over that, and clear it over that to prevent the kind of animal destruction that can occur to something like something.
Oh, you were concerned about animals not getting to it, or?
Well, yeah, not getting to it. Well, you can easily spread the remains around in such a way that you can have opposed to not good.
Was she in any way dismembered? Was she buried whole? Or?
Yeah. I mean, yes, we should find all of it.
Here we've got some really interesting signature behaviors by Ted Bundy. The crutches and the briefcase. He's a very handsome young man. How does he use this particular signature to his advantage?
To draw in his victims. He's very specific about what he's doing. He's very specific about who his victims are. He's very specific about his means of abduction. So this is a very controlled operator who knows exactly what he's doing, who's duping his victims into them thinking they're helping him, when in reality he's just wanting to abduct.
And of course, what aids in terms of this particular signature is even the make of vehicle he uses. The VW Beetle has its boot at the front, far easier to push his unsuspecting victim into.
So he knows exactly what he's doing, and he's designed the scenario to maximize the chances of him being successful in what he wants to do, which is to abduct young women.
Bundy's favored hunting grounds were the vast open college campuses of America. There he would find an endless supply of attractive and intelligent women, exactly the kind of prey he sought out. He would stalk the campuses, posing as an injured freshman. Once he had gained his victim's sympathy, he would strike.
There's no greater example of a lady killer in a very literal sense than Ted Bundy. He could sweep women off the streets, he could charm them out of their houses. He had very little difficulty picking up victims as his career progressed. And he was ultimately so horrifically vicious towards females.
Ted Bundy's actual entrapment and kill MO was very simple. He'd have his victim brought into his space. She was now in his web. There was no escape. He'd hit her, knock her unconscious, sometimes bind her, put her in the back of a van or in the back of stuff her in his car and drive her away. I mean, he's not going to kill her where there are thousands of people sunbathing. He needs her out of there now. She's totally under his control, and he will take her to a location that he knows is safe, away from prying eyes. She'll come round, or he'll wake her up, and then he will start using her and abusing her and raping her. Possibly telling her at the same time that if she behaves and doesn't kick up a fuss, I'll let you go home, because she's never going to go home. Then when he's sexually satisfied himself, and we're talking about a very sadistic man who would probably torture and cut and strangle and let off again and strangle, let off again, then he would kill her. And he would kill her by bludgeoning with a rock or a tree limb and smash the skull.
Okay, I just said that the Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road 25 to 50 yards and buried in a location about 10 yards west of the road on a rocky hillside.
I've noticed with a lot of serial killers where the skull is very, very seriously damaged, it shows a hatred for women, an underlying hatred. It is smashing the part of the body up which has caused the problem. The mind, the head has caused the problem. It's a dark place to go, but that's what happened. He is smashing this up.
Yeah, probably you found the damage to the head, the jaw in particular, probably broken. But if you found that, you would have known who it was.
However he may have presented it as a considered rational decision, the decision of an intelligent man, psychologically, it's actually very basic. It's actually about all the standard reasons for confessing. So actually, it's about him seeking to justify what he's doing. And we see this very directly in the way that he wants to talk to Bob Keppel, the famous detective, about the why, as he puts it. And Bob Keppel cuts him down straight away. He says, doesn't really help us knowing the why. Bob Keppel's very aware that that's the reason why Bundy is sitting in front of him. He wants to justify what he's done.
I don't think anybody doubts that I've done some bad things. The question is what, of course, and how, and maybe even most importantly, why.
Really, why you're caught anything?
I'm not trying to convince you, Bob, that you should be interested in the why if you're not. I think there are a lot of people are. I know I am. I think a lot of people are interested in why. People constantly will ask me, why?
Well, let's talk about the why. We know that he's abducting young women. He talks quite a lot in these confessions about sex, sexual fantasy. He talks quite a lot about the girly magazines, girls wearing hot pants. This is somebody who's motivated in a classic serial killer way by sexual fantasy.
He knows who he's targeting. He gets sexually excited by them. So sex is an element within his modus operandi.
How does the interviewer know that the interviewee isn't simply going to dupe him?
If you're the interviewer, then you're always assessing the quality and accuracy of the information that you're given. Do you think it's true? Does it match with other things? Or is it just superfluous? And the interviewee will want to know, actually, what are the questions you're asking? Why are you asking them? How relevant are they to what it is that you want to share? Are they helping you understand yourself? Because many offenders don't understand themselves, and actually through an interviewing process you can help them understand why they committed their offence if they want to know, if they have a blockage somewhere along the line.
Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous serial killers in history. Shortly before his death by electrocution, he offered detectives an audience in the theatre of his depraved mind. Those taped interviews have now been reanimated using cutting-edge lip-sync technology.
I don't think anybody doubts that I've done some bad things. The question is what, of course, and how, and maybe even most importantly, why.
Bundy didn't target vulnerable women on the fringes of society, such as sex workers or runaways. He chose college girls in the prime of their lives. The reasons for him brutally killing these girls may be traced back to his earliest known rejections by the opposite sex.
His first girlfriend was a beauty, long, dark-haired girl, extremely attractive, with wealthy parents. And she invited Ted to meet her father and mother, and like many fathers do, we all know this, the daughter brings the boyfriend home, and the father says, well, I don't think you're quite what you think you are, young man. I don't want you to see my daughter again. And Ted took a great affront at that. He was dumped by this girl, who was going to be his arm candy, respectable arm candy for years to come, and she dumped him. And it was a slap in the face to Ted, who was trying so hard to become somebody special, and he harboured a grudge. And when we look at All of Ted's victims, if we were to put all the photographs on a piece of paper in a row, you would think they were all sisters.
Bundy eluded capture for so long because he was a transitory killer who murdered across the country and disposed of his victims far from the places where he'd abducted them.
Ted Bundy's crimes were committed before computers properly existed. And he killed his victims over a vast, wide area of America. And so it was very difficult for law enforcement to connect the dots, to work out that these killings were connected. And that enabled him to continue killing at random for a lot longer than he certainly would have done today.
One of the problems in America is, compared to Britain, it's extremely large. It's nearly 40 times the size of the UK, with thousands of police forces. And what happens is, if you commit a murder in one state, you can travel, like in California, 2,000 miles to another part of the state, and the police forces will not communicate to each other. In those days, they didn't have the internet like we have today. So you could quite easily kill somebody, move the body to a different part of the state, and the police would never link the murders together.
During a 10-year killing cycle, Bundy had murdered close to 30 women. The sheer number of victims and their visual similarities convinced the police they were dealing with a serial killer. And over time, Bundy's name would repeatedly be presented to the police as being a possible suspect.
What's interesting is one of his girlfriends, when he was at Washington, she actually reported him to the police as a suspect. Also, his university professor reported him to the police because the police had reports of a man in a brown beetle, with some form of injury and possibly the name Ted as the killer. So they knew about him in the early 1970s. His girlfriend reported him, the professors reported him, but the police didn't have enough evidence to push the case. Plus, he was one of many other suspects.
Bundy was arrested on suspicion of the murder of a sophomore student. Whilst at the police station, he escaped and immediately made his way to the Florida State University campus. Where he would carry out his final deadly act, the frenzied bludgeoning of 2 girls. As well as beating the girls to death, he'd bite one of them. The cruel irony being, it was teeth marks from his dazzling smile that would be amongst the most compelling physical evidence to hold up in court.
Bob Keppel was a highly experienced investigator. Realizing that time with Bundy was running out, he used every weapon in his arsenal to try and turn the tables on the serial killer. The scenes that followed wouldn't have looked out of place in the movie The Silence of the Lambs. In a bid to appeal to Bundy's vanity and narcissism, Keppel asked Bundy to offer his own unique insight into the Green River murders, another serial killer case that Keppel was working on back home in Washington State.
Asking Bundy for his professional advice would years later look like a masterstroke, as he provided a chillingly accurate assessment for how the killer, who would much later be revealed as Gary Ridgway, was operating and how he could be caught.
Well, first of all, he's trying to dispose of the bodies where they won't be found. This guy doesn't want to get caught. I think it's clear that over time you can see him, at least it would appear, that over time he's trying to improve his dump sites. He's trying to get better at disposing of his bodies.
Bundy was killing in the same area, the Pacific Northwest. He had enough knowledge about the areas to give advice, and he actually did give sensible advice because he knew the kind of framework that Gary Ridgway was working in. It takes one to know one almost, and he was very good at doing that.
What he's doing to Bob Keppel and the investigators is he's trying again to be this authority figure. Only I know what a man like that could do. I would think he would do this and he would do that because, you know, I'm an expert on this thing. I'm a sort of a student, if you will, on these sort of things. And he's watching the police lean towards him and listening and writing notes. And he's, again, like in court, the star of the show.
Let's say he's continuing to kill. Still in the Seattle area. We found these locations out here. What would his next step be?
Who knows? This guy is learning. He's trying to find the best way to dispose of his bodies he can think of.
Bundy is able to help Keppel in identifying what the Green River killer, Gary Ridgway, may do, identifying correctly that he may be going back to the bodies. And this will have played absolutely perfectly into his self-conceptualization as the expert, as an expert, albeit that expertise is in serial killing. Nonetheless, to Bundy, that's what's significant. That's what matters to him, to his ego, is the fact that he's the professional, he's the expert, so he would have loved being able to help in this way.
We've accomplished something here, but I don't feel like we've really joined heads on this thing. I don't know what you want to do. I know you've been on this case, so to speak, the Bundy case, for a long time.
This is somebody whose life story, whose behaviour is driven by the desire to remain in control, to remain calm, to be competent, to show their efficiency, their effectiveness, all in a very understated, professional, carrying out a job type of way. And that's how he sees what he's done, and that's how he's trying to present himself very clearly in the confession context. And we see this both presentationally, in the way he speaks, the fluency, the articulate nature of the way he speaks. We see it in the way he tries at times to take charge of the interview situation. He's trying to reconstrue the confession scenario as a kind of business deal situation. We see him saying things like, well guys, I think we've achieved something here, as if they were working on a professional business project together.
I'd like to ask one last question. One last one. When and where were you first murdered?
Okay, one more question. We'll have to do that some other time. There is another time.
As Bundy's appointment with Old Sparky, the electric chair, grew ever closer, so he became increasingly desperate to engage with the authorities in a bid to buy himself more time. In 1989, serial killer Ted Bundy awaited execution on death row. Until his last breath, he was determined to seduce and enthrall all those who came before him. A series of audio recordings of his final conversations were made. Lip sync technology can now, for the first time, allow us to watch the face-off between Bundy and the police.
We've accomplished something here, but I don't feel like we've really joined heads on this thing. I don't know what you want to do. I know you've been on this case, so to speak, the Bundy case, for a long time.
In the final analysis, Ted Bundy's death row confessions offered little by way of information that would help detectives solve the many more crimes he was suspected of having committed. But what they clearly demonstrate is that up until their final breath, psychopathic murderers will do everything they can to create a stage from which they can continue to preach their dark gospel, with no thought whatsoever for the innocent lives they've ended, or the grieving families that they leave behind with so many unanswered questions.
It's a dirt road. I mean, a steep climb, not really, I mean, a short, steep ascent up a little incline, and then wound up to the left.
Bundy's offer of information on the whereabouts of victims and identities of victims became more and more vacuous as the police realised that he really couldn't remember. These individuals were just objects. He didn't really note them as being individuals at the time when he was killing. He just saw them as something that he could possess, to own forever, to kill, and it would keep their spirit forever. And as the police began to realise this, they began to realise that his time was running out.
There was, well, at a certain point I did pull off the side of this road after, let's say, a mile, roughly.
Bundy's last night, late in the evening, he was interviewed by Dr. Dobson. You'll notice that there might be a bang behind the door, and you see him jump. Because he knows he's going to be dead in the morning, but he thinks they're coming from him already, so there's a terror there. Quite frankly, the police are not interested anymore. They want a little bit of information. They want him sitting in that chair as fast as possible, and so do the victims next to kin. And at the very end, when Bundy was executed, they shaved him, they put a sanitary towel in his anus, and they tied an elastic band around his penis, and they shaved his head. And you've got to remember that his human dignity is gone when he's shaved and he's prepared for execution. And that's when his whole psychopathology, his ego just collapses. And there he is, taken, staggering, and strapped down into an electric chair, terrified, because within minutes, he's going to be burned to death.
Did you buy this line that he uses to explain the journey that he takes? He says, people find various outlets for their insecurities and hostilities and tend to compensate for them in various ways. Is he compensating for his insecurities and hostilities by killing young women?
Well, he's just justifying to himself why it is that he get engaged in that activity, when by that question he's acknowledging actually there's other routes, there's other paths he could have taken, but he chose not to.
I got the impression that Bundy won the interview war, but ultimately lost because he was executed.
As he was always going to do. So it was always just delaying the process and actually getting the maximum benefit that he could seek and obtain from being interviewed by the authorities and game playing with them. So in a sense he extended his life, and in that he had the mental chess with the authorities. But ultimately he was never going to win, because actually the day of execution would come.
Well, sure, yeah. I threw away the briefcase and the crutches and all that stuff. Yeah. And the crowbar, everything. Handcuffs, everything. I'd get mad at myself 2 weeks later because I'd have to go out and buy another pair. I mean, it's not comical, but that's what would happen.
One of the things that made Bundy so compelling to listen to was the fact that he was a natural-born storyteller. His way with words created a self-perpetuating myth that survives even to this day.
It feels with Ted Bundy, when he's talking towards just before his execution, that he's living vicariously through an extraordinary story. A story that he almost feels he's invented. And he's certainly the ultimate creative force in this story, and he drives it forward. And as he talks about what has happened, it's almost like he's making sure all the boxes are ticked, that dramatically he's got the right high points, the right low points.
I just said that the Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards.
That quiet voice he uses during a lot of the interviews That's part of his performance. This is a guy who's found himself at the center of a drama of horrendous proportions, and he's milking every minute of that drama by showing himself to be this almost Oscar-winning actor, because some of his performances during these interviews are like that. They're like he's the actor pretending to be Ted Bundy.
He is the poster boy for American psychopathy. A seducer, an arrogant, manipulative seducer. Charming. Even when he's talking about the most dreadful things, he does it in a kind of soothing, detached manner. Frightening.
I've got the mileage left in me tonight, and I want to give it a shot. Give it the one that's most likely to produce something for somebody.
Bundy's death row confessions totaled some 30 hours. But instead of being the proposed exercise of helping the police to resolve unsolved crimes, they were instead a masterclass in how a serial killer will try to assert power and control over everyone they encounter.
It's almost spider-like. One of the things that this also most disturbs me is the kind of fan club that he seems to have generated amongst other women who had nothing to do with this case whatsoever. And that the sexual attraction from them is extremely disconcerting. And again, I struggle to understand. In terms of a kind of cultural subgroup, how extensive is it? How many women are there that are attracted to this kind of person? Extraordinary.
Bundy's legion of adoring admirers only chose to see the charming side of the seducer, not the murderer of innocent young women. But when the end drew near, his dark facade began to crack.
As Ted Bundy's ploys began to fail, you began to see revealed behind this charming mask, this handsome mask, this superstar persona, revealed behind that, slowly but surely, was the psychopathic, uncaring person who had delivered deadly force towards endless numbers of young girls, and probably would have done forevermore had he not been caught.
He was the all-American boy who turned the all-American dream into a living nightmare. There's a lot of romanticism around Ted Bundy. It's ludicrous. Let's not forget, he cracked his victims' skulls open, he raped them, he mutilated them, and then he buried them. And often didn't even admit where he buried them, which put their families through even more anguish. He was truly evil, even if he may have looked on the outside like a very decent, respectable, middle-class person.
If you'd have seen the scenes of crime photographs and the terrible tragedies and the brutality of Bundy snatching and tearing away such beautiful lives and destroying families and the pain and suffering he's caused, if anybody deserved to be executed, it was Ted Bundy.
Coming up tomorrow night here on CBS Reality, two best-selling authors set off to Northern Ireland to revisit the details of a shocking double homicide. Don't miss another chance to see Written in Blood at 9. Next, though, a demented murderer opens up in a chilling jailhouse confession. Stay with us for Voice of a Serial Killer.